wherever in the world you might be. My name is Tanya Karas. I'm a senior editor with Devex, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first event of our Newsmaker series focused on Latin America. This is a region that has been very hard hit by the pandemic, with some of the highest death tolls, especially in proportion to the region's population. Its economic recovery is also lagging behind much of the rest of the world, with poverty, inequality, and food insecurity on the rise. And this region is also home to 3 humanitarian crises that are going on at once in Venezuela, in Central America, and in Haiti, where we have a reporter, Teresa Welsh, reporting from this week. And so what's next for the global development community? I, for one, am really excited to learn from these conversations that we've got planned around this, and it's so great to have all of you here. I'm going to introduce my colleague, Raj Kumar. He is the president and editor-in-chief of Devex. Hi, Raj, it's really good to see you.
It's great to be with you, Tanya. Nice to see you, and nice to be with all of you who are joining us from all over. Good to be here.
So, Raj, can you tell us, what are you hoping to learn from these conversations?
Yeah, I guess my feeling, Tanya, is that we like to cover underreported stories at Devex, and it feels to me the development conversations that I'm part of often neglect Latin America and the Caribbean in general, and specifically now, given what you just said, how hard hit the region has been. I mean, I've heard people throwing around terms like we're going to have a lost decade in Latin America, and it feels like we're kind of at a crossroads. And this is a moment when the development community needs to kind of lean forward and pay attention to what's happening in the region and what can the development community do to change that trajectory, to change that dynamic. So that's why we thought it was so important to bring these conversations to the Devex community and to really talk to some of the experts who are at the forefront of these issues.
Definitely. And something I've been thinking a lot about is, we talk a lot about wealthy nations and we talk a lot about low income nations. And, something that we hear from everyone, from the World Bank to the IMF, to everyone in the development community, talking about this divergent recovery. And I think a lot of countries in Latin America are really at risk of being left behind. And as you said, this is really, it's a make or break moment for this region.
And it's not an easy set of questions, right? So there's no clear, simple answer. I think we'll see that as we go through the conversations with some of these experts. But as you said at the beginning, the region's been really hard hit. When you think about the health consequences, it's something like 30% of the world's COVID deaths occurred in Latin America, which is only 8% of the world's population. You saw the economic decline in many countries. The global decline was about 3% of the world's economy. In Latin America, it was 7%. And again, the problems there seem to be systemic and long-term. And so there's no kind of quick and easy fix, but we want to get into, well, what are the fixes? Even if they are long-term and systemic, what can be done to change this trajectory? And that's why it just seems like an important moment to be having that discussion.
Yeah, for sure.
Maybe I could just say a word, Tanya, about who all we have in the series of conversations, because we're really honored. You'll be hearing soon about a session we're going to do with Roberta Jacobson, who was the United States ambassador to Mexico. She was the Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere. And just this year, she was President Biden's point person on the US border crisis. So we're going to talk a lot about migration and Central America and Mexico in that discussion with her. We're also going to be doing a newsmaker as part of this series with Santiago Levy, who is pretty well known and pretty famous among development circles for being the architect of some of the cash transfer programs that are now quite popular around Latin America, and that I think will come up in many conversations, including today. He's a development analyst on a lot of these topics, but held senior positions in Mexico's finance ministry over many years, and now is at Brookings and is a thoughtful writer and analyst on these topics. And then today, we're about to start our really exciting conversation with Luis Alberto Moreno, who probably needs no introduction to this group. He's among the most prominent leaders in Latin America. He was for 15 years the president of the Inter-American Development Bank. He just recently finished his time there, and he's now a managing director at Allen and Company, a prominent investment bank. He's on the board of the World Economic Forum, the International Olympic Committee, and many, too many to mention. But he's spent his career focused on exactly these issues. So I'm really excited to get a chance to talk with him about it.
Great. Well, I will let you guys get started. I can't wait to hear it.
Thanks, Tanya. And so let me use that as a moment to welcome you, Luis, to the discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, Luis Alberto Moreno, thank you for taking some time to be with us at Devex today.
No, thank you very much, Raj, and thank you very much for the work you do and for focusing on these issues. I think the way you frame it is exactly what's going on, and the set of challenges, as you correctly said, are not going to be fixed overnight. This is a long journey, but a very important one that will have huge consequences if we don't get it right.
So, do you feel like we're at a crossroads in Latin America now? I mean, I saw the piece you wrote in Foreign Affairs earlier this year, and you talked about how Latin America has gone through various periods of development and growth. And is it fair to say this is, an actual crossroads moment, or is it just everyone has been hit by the pandemic? It's really a global issue. Latin America is no different. Or is there something really unique about Latin America and the situation it finds itself in today?
Well, look, it's always good to put these things into context. Clearly, COVID and the consequences of COVID are, still to be analyzed. I think the world over, there's probably a handful of countries that got it right, but the majority of the world did not get it right. Managing COVID is like managing a ship in the middle of the storm and not knowing where the correct north is, what measures to take. But if you just look back at, say, the last 20 years, poverty rates went from 42% down to 23%. And the middle class rose from about 23% to 38%. So you cannot say that there was no improvements. And I think in general, you saw that really throughout the emerging world. However, there were other consequences of this, and the biggest of which I believe is inequality, which is something that is out there and has manifested itself in so many ways. And I think it's at the core of any development discussion, because now more than ever, these questions of inequality are going to have a bigger toll on how things advance forward, and they will definitely have an impact on our political discourse. And so this, to me, is one of the focuses that we should not lose. Certainly, the consequences, like I was saying, of COVID, we will have a long time to analyze. There's a lot of discussion as to what a new social contract should look like. And here I'm referring to issues of education and health, which are so central. And and of course, what we're seeing this year, like in other parts of the world, is this kind of V-shaped recovery. There's a lot of growth taking place, but at the same time, it is helped by a combination of high commodity prices. At the same time, the dollar has become stronger, which means that, the pass-through of inflation to many emerging economies has, you see the major central banks increasing interest rates because of the inflationary pressures. So the bigger question is, what comes next in the next 2 or 3 years? And I think also COVID was a wake-up call, because in a way, it awakened every society to its own realities. It basically showed these huge disparities in very vivid ways. And I think this is the other aspect of how you can course correct and move forward.
Why do you think Latin America fared worse in terms of the health consequences of COVID? Like, is it connected directly to inequality? Latin America is the most unequal part of the world. Is that partly why the situation was so much worse?
Look, I think, I'm not a health expert, but I would say a number of things. First of all, the reality was that the developed world, with roughly 10 countries with no more than 30% of the world's population, had access to vaccines way in advance of everybody else. And I think that made a big difference. Secondly, it's when you look at, say, Africa and Latin America, what's the fundamental, aside from the levels of development, the fundamental difference is the rural nature of Africa vis-a-vis the urban nature of Latin America. I mean, close to 80% of people live in cities. The fact that you have a very large informal labor market, which meant that not everybody could do what we're doing right now and working on Zoom, as opposed to, because that's basically a service for a service-driven economy, which is largely the case of countries like the United States. Here, people had to physically go out and work. So,
and Latin America is known to have more than half the workforce in Latin America is informal.
It's informal and it is hand labor as opposed to just the services. And then the other aspect is the cost of connectivity. I mean, 1 in 2 Latin Americans don't have access to connectivity. You even see it, as we know, in the United States, there's pockets of US population that have no access to connectivity either because there's no bandwidth, or if there's the bandwidth, there is, the high cost of entering and being able to be connected. So all of these things had a consequence, even though you could argue that many of our health systems, depending on the country, were not that bad. I mean, already countries were doing vaccinations, but never at this scale. So it was not enough, as we found out, to get vaccines. Once you got the vaccines, how do you go about getting the whole of the population vaccinated? And here is another aspect. And then, as we all have learned, the variants simply make matters worse the later you are in the cycle of doing the vaccination process.
Yeah, now the IMF is saying, to your point about the recovery, like the V shape, everyone's recovering to some degree, but Latin America seems to be recovering slower. The IMF is saying it'll take till 2025 before per capita income gets back to where it was before the pandemic. I mean, is that connected as well to this inequality question? What do you think is the reason why the bounce back is slower for people in this region?
Well, clearly the amount of fiscal stimulus that you looked at the developed world vis-a-vis the emerging world, and concretely in Latin America, the average is no more than 4%. There were certainly countries like Brazil or Peru or others that did major fiscal stimulus that prevented, the downward spiral that you saw. And so to get back to the numbers of income per capita is going to depend certainly on growth. But this was kind of an unforced kind of situation on countries. The whole situation of debt, the whole situation of hunger that many people went through, all of that simply accelerated. And you see it in many areas. A lot has been said about education. I mean, people see it. We were talking earlier with you about your 2 kids who even in the United States have been, for the last year and a half going through Zoom. Many people in Latin America don't even have that possibility. So think about what that generation didn't just lose a year and a half. It could very well have lost double that amount, or who knows how much. So these are the adjustments that we're going to have to see and be very focused on.
Yeah, these are big long-term ones. And the question is, what do you do in the short run? Right? I mean, thinking of your home country in Colombia, I was there in May when all of a sudden protests broke out and people were feeling really frustrated. And obviously the pandemic, in a way, slowed down some protest movements that had existed in many other places, Chile and Ecuador and elsewhere, that had cropped up in 2019. How do you manage? You talk to a lot of the leaders of these countries. Like, how do you think about managing the demands of people right now who say, I need access to social services today, with these higher level challenges of, well, the countries are indebted, there isn't much fiscal space, raising taxes and changing systems takes a long time. How do you manage this? And is there like an immediate crisis afoot here?
Look, you are correct in that many of these protests were there even prior to the pandemic, as we recall, in countries like Chile, which was really a shock to everybody because, Chile, is a country that is truly an outlier in the positive sense. Any indicator that you look at, by comparison to the rest of Latin America, Chile has always done better. And yet, all of a sudden, it seemed like there was this desperation out there in Chile, which began to be contagious. Today, if anything, the reality for Latin Americans is that people are more educated, they're more connected, they're more aware of what goes on in the world. And so you saw this connectivity. Well, those protests, of course, tended to kind of lower down before the pandemic. And then, as you correctly said at the beginning, then they basically stopped. When you were there in Colombia, one of the unfortunate consequences of all these, massive turnouts of people is that it only accelerated the pandemic. As we have seen in many places when people very early on start to go out and do not keep the social distance, that's part of what happened. And therefore, the reality of why this was happening had to do a lot with the fact that there was very slow economic growth in the past 5 years prior to the pandemic, probably one of the lowest in many, many years. So already you saw a situation where, those great advances that we saw that I mentioned earlier in the last 20 years were decelerating. And I think the other aspect is that this identity politics, this divisiveness, and kind of like these forces against incumbents have essentially lost the notion that all of these positive achievements, somehow we have been able to forget them. And instead of constructing and looking forward, all of that identity politics makes you rewind and rethink about the past. And when countries get stuck into that, then very quickly the collective situation becomes very negative. And certainly there's a lot of people who have suffered tremendously. And there were a lot of people equally during the pandemic who were very generous and tried to do as best as they could to help, their neighbor, and where they saw these very tense situations. And, to me, that's the million-dollar question. How are Latin American societies, how are elites going to react to this? Because it's at the center of how countries are viable or not going forward. This is so to me, the big change is how we're going to adapt to a fundamental new reality, and where the time lapse that we have to correct things is much shorter than before.
Do you think there's a chance we might see something akin to the Arab Spring happen in Latin America? Like a season of many countries at once going into significant protests and political upheaval?
Look, I think everything is possible. I mean, certainly we have seen this cycle of elections that will finish next year, where you will have elections in countries like Brazil, like my own country, in Colombia, as you know. And it's going to be very interesting to see how different countries react and what kind of governments they elect. Those governments are going to have a huge challenge in front of them, because you can try to get people on the streets and protest and the rest of it, but then you have to govern. And how do you govern? And how you focus on the issues of inequality in a very substantial way. And that takes me to something that Raj, you do a lot, and a lot of work that Devex does, is that the world today, especially the developed world, is very focused correctly on climate change. But I think we cannot lose sight of the fundamental problems that we have in development, not only in Latin America, even in middle-income countries where we have all these big pockets of poverty, that if we don't focus on the inequality issues, on the pure bread and butter development issues, you can do everything you want on climate change, but if you don't take care of that, we have to integrate those two agendas. And I think that's part and parcel of how I hope the development community begins to think about this.
Yeah, that's just another layer on top of the challenge for the region. I mean, I think you have countries like Colombia, like Brazil, Mexico, Ecuador, that get a lot of their revenue from fossil fuels. And presumably, if the world starts really, truly moving away from them, as we need to for the climate crisis, what happens? You were talking about these are countries already feeling indebted. What happens? How do they make that transition happen realistically? What is your feeling about that transition for countries like those?
Look, I think every country, and more than every country, every society in the region is seeing the effects of climate change. We were talking earlier about Central America. I mean, part of the reason you have in the so-called Northern Triangle countries a lot of migrants is because all you have to do is go and observe. For instance, they're largely agricultural producers. Because of climate change, the yields on, say, coffee and some of the basic agricultural products that they have dropped significantly. People are basically left without, any capacity to sustain an income. And so therefore they become migrants immediately because they see no opportunity in their home country. So this is an issue that requires a lot of attention. And I also believe that, definitely we're going to see this huge energy transition. Countries are going to want to go through that. And that energy transition will mean, especially for those countries that are big oil producers, that they're going to have to transition to something else. What is that something else? I think there is an opportunity clearly around how countries create the platforms such that you can, there will be more and more big global companies looking to change, or at least have as a resilience, different supply chains. But that is not something that governments do, other than to create the platform to do just that. But it's businesses who will come and need a good environment. Not every country will benefit from this. But on the other hand, how public investment is utilized, how investments in infrastructure will have a very high return. These are the kinds of things of fine-tuning public investment that are going to be central going forward.
And what do you think about the international community, right? You led the Inter-American Development Bank, so you've seen these issues very close. There's some criticism out there that says like the multilateral development bank should have done more in this crisis, or should do more now. Looking at regions like Latin America and how much is left to do to get out of the hole that the region is in. What do you think? Do you think that these institutions are being a little too timid at the wrong moment and they should be more aggressive? Some people have called for, being willing to reduce their own credit ratings in order to lend more, find new vehicles to lend more, grant more. Should they be doing something different from your vantage point?
Look, I definitely believe that, in my last year at the IDB, which was last year, the minute that we saw, COVID hitting, we ended up basically, of our total lending was mostly done between March and September in a record year. I mean, the IDB had never lent as much, both through its private sector arm as from the public sector arm. I do believe that the question of how best to use the balance sheet is a big question, because I think every country in the world has fiscal tensions as a result of COVID. And therefore, I think you need to be very creative in ways that you can use your balance sheet better, in ways of how you crowd in using guarantees. And here the conversation is very important between, let's say, the developed countries and the emerging countries, in a way that, these institutions were created to take not less risk, but more risk. But over time, the rating agencies and this whole the whole economic complex of the financial complex of institutions, I think, has to migrate and review this in a very substantial way, such that you can take more risk, lend more, have more regional public goods if you're a regional development bank, or public goods if you're a global institution like the World Bank. And I think this is going to be, the big discussion that needs to take place going forward.
And what about the bilateral aid agencies, USAID and others, and some of the other, many of the wealthy donor countries, including the UK, for example, have cut back on their foreign aid spending. I mean, Latin America, a lot of the countries are a bit too rich in a way to be seen as destinations for foreign aid, but then you have many others like Haiti and the countries in Central America. Are the big donor countries basically sleepwalking through this crisis, or should they be stepping up more, doing something different? What do you think? Look,
one of the biggest challenges I constantly encountered and in talking to all of these donors is the notion that if you just look at income per capita and you say, well, this is the time that we should graduate this country A or B or C. The reality is that there is no middle income country that does not have within it a region that is very poor. I mean, typically, you can be in any capital city in Latin America and you be parts of that city that are no different than Brussels. But then you have the rest of the city that has real issues of poverty, not to mention in the rural areas, which are always the Cinderella of many countries. So I do believe that in those pockets of poverty is very cost efficient to use smartly development assistance. And that development assistance, as I was saying earlier, has to be connected with what you're doing in terms of reducing inequality. And therefore, the notion that the bilateral donors don't look at this, and I think there's been some change in that. I remember, for instance, I saw a profound change in the French Development Agency in the last 4 or 5 years. The same with the German Development Agency. USAID has, as you know, being the largest, a very different kind of approach. The reality is they don't do that much in Latin America by comparison, let's say, to what they do in Africa. But I think that the secret here is ways to leverage more their development in working together with regional or global institutions.
I wonder if you think that's a mistake. I mean, I noticed in your piece in Foreign Affairs, you talk about the possible negative effects in Latin America could blow back on the US. And China is having a really growing role in Latin America. Do you think there's some dynamic here that might get the US Congress to change their approach here and say, actually, Latin America needs to be a higher priority? Should they think in those terms?
I wish they would. But you have plenty of issues today, as we know, in Washington that keeps the US distracted. But look, this notion that Latin America is an afterthought is a problem because, you know, you're waking up to realities, as you just mentioned. China today is the #1 trading partner of Argentina, of Brazil, of Peru, of Chile. And yes, it's in a handful of commodities. We're largely been commodities exporters, but they have been investing more so every day. So I do believe that this is a lost opportunity. I think there is so much rich connectivity between the US and Latin America at every level. I mean, about societies where, we're very, very much, numbers of people who come and are educated in the States. So a lot of the elites for many, many years have been very well connected to the US, but it is not enough to have that. And you mentioned initially the case of Venezuela is dramatic. Haiti, a country I spend a lot of time, is very, very sad to see what's happening there. And more importantly, the fact that many of these migrants are coming from not from Haiti, but are Haitians who went to Chile, went to Brazil. And, there's almost like 40,000 of them who have been now moving from Chile, from Colombia through through Panama to come to the US, and, because they're looking for more opportunity.
And just thinking about what that journey is actually like. I mean, you know the region so well as a Colombian yourself, but imagining people walking through that region, right? It's a dangerous, incredible.
Very one. No question. It is terribly dangerous. For decades, people would not go through there because of the difficulties. And it's incredible to see people, when people have needs, they do things they don't even think they would do. And that's what we're seeing today.
Yeah, and I guess you seem to be concerned about, when I look at some of your writings and speaking on this topic, that this could all lead to rising populism, both on the right and on the left, and that maybe we get more political polarization in the region that doesn't actually address some of these root issues. What are you seeing? You have your finger very much on the pulse of that political situation.
Look, I think populism has its origins on the political cleavages that basically show these huge amounts of inequality, because inequality essentially breeds populism. It can come from the center, from the right, from the left. But unfortunately, that doesn't resolve the problems. I mean, at the end of the day, good governance is something you have to practice every day. There is no good development if you don't have good institutions. And good institutions are about the people that are not only the laws that organize them, but the people who execute those laws through the different kinds of institutions. Equally, the big discussion in any country is how do you allocate your budget, and how effective is the public investment that is done. Again, institutions are critical here. And so it's very easy to be distracted when the logic is us against them. And it's all this identity politics that is created around the world, a sense of just get rid of the incumbents. And that just makes matters much more difficult.
Yeah, I noticed in one of your pieces, you talked about trust levels. And I got to believe before you even get to the point of addressing something like populism, people have to trust each other. And you've referred a few times to the elites in Latin America, which is certainly a dynamic there. And I think the statistic you've quoted before from Gallup is 4% of Colombians say that they can trust each other. I mean, it's a shockingly low number, but if you don't have that trust, how do you build a society where you believe in, and maybe a challenging thing like raising taxes in order to fund a new social program?
Look, you've touched on something that I think the world over, but especially is acute in Latin America, is the minute that societies start to lose trust with their government and amongst themselves, it's very difficult to create some kind of collective action around something. I mean, individuals don't write laws. Individuals do not govern countries. It is the collective effort and the collective focus of societies to want to address problems. You know, when you look at polls in Latin America, you find that you know, the credence in how democracy is seen as a solution has dropped consistently in the Latin Barometer poll. I've been watching for the last 5 or 6 years. Every year it has been coming down. And then on the other hand is how do societies work through this? I think it is little by little by constructing ways of getting to that level of trust. And unfortunately, that has been broken. And unless we course correct, it's very difficult to take some of the tough decisions.
So what are some, in just a few minutes we have left, what are some of the things you're advising leaders of some of the countries you talk to actually go and tangibly do today? You know, should they be raising more social safety net, for example, programs? Should they be raising taxes on elites? Like, what are some of the things you see, that specific steps that could be taken at this point?
Look, clearly, you know, when you look at you compare, for instance, the difference between the income in developed countries and in Latin American countries to the state, maybe it's a 5% difference. But the taxation and the progressiveness of taxation takes you to the fact that in developed countries, you can reduce inequality by, say, 30+%, and in Latin America, it's only 5. So we have a fundamental problem in our taxation system and the progressiveness of our taxation system. That's clearly an issue. Another issue is, you know, what I was saying earlier, you know, how do you focus budgets? We are still a young population in Latin America, but that's ending. I mean, we went through a youth bulge, and then we had a demographic bonus, but now we're getting into ages of close to 31, 32 years old, and some countries even higher. That means that pensions will weigh in significantly in any fiscal budget. And how do we deal with the situation that big areas of our population are going to need the government to help them, you know, during the retirement age, in a time where life expectancy is even longer? So addressing those long-term issues. Look, at the end of the day, the only way to do this is to look at the short term, the midterm, and the long term. And governments have to be good enough to address all those things at the same time. They're very different, but more and more what has happened today is that the short-term issues are determining a lot of the long-term issues. And the longer you take in not addressing those long-term issues, the more acute the problems become.
Well, that may be a great point to end our discussion on, because you've really framed out, I think, to start our series of discussions on the region and its future, exactly how significant the challenges are and where they break out. And this idea of short and long term is so true. It feels like if we can't get through the immediate crisis today, we can't get to the long term root causes. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today, Luis Alberto, and for sharing all of these ideas. It's been really valuable.
No, thank you. And it's always a pleasure. And congratulations always on all the great work you guys do.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you. I want to welcome onto the screen, if I can, Sabrina Stein. And Sabrina is the Senior Program Analyst for Advocacy in the Latin America program at OSF. Open Society Foundations, who have been supporting this series of conversations that we're doing. We really appreciate that support, Sabrina. And I wanted to get your immediate take as somebody who, well, you're from Latin America, you spent a lot of time focusing on the region. The conversation we just had, myself and Luis Alberto, what are some of your immediate takeaways?
Well, first, Raj, thank you so much for having me, and thanks to Devex for hosting this series of events, very timely. And as you said, being from Latin America and working on Latin America, we do see, I mean, a lot of what Mr. Moreno says is very worrisome and accurate, but we're hoping from Open Society to try to find the opportunities that could come out of this crisis, to try not to focus on all the negative news and articles that we're reading about the region, but really see how we can use this as an inflection point to think about what kind of societies we want to build, what kind of countries we want to have, and how to use this opportunity to kind of correct the wrongs from the past and look at kind of a justice-centered recovery and how to move forward from the pandemic that hit us so hard in the last year and a half.
Yeah, so much of the foundation's focus is on democracy and rights. And it sounds like when you think, a lot of what Luis Alberto Moreno talked about are kind of economic issues, maybe, fiscal issues, but at the bottom level, they all come back to this issue of rights and democratic representation and trust in society. What do you think are some of the keys to unlocking this, to actually getting from sort of protests in the street to real change?
Well, I think some of what Mr. Moreno said really comes to heart to the work of the foundations, that we're talking about states and governments that are not responding to the needs of our communities and our societies. And so it does come to an issue of rights. I think the economic and political rights are very much connected, and usually those who are most marginalized and at the edges of decision-making and political decision-making are those who are also the least likely to kind of benefit from this economic development that we saw in the last 2 decades in Latin America. And that, as the pandemic showed us, that were very fragile gains, and we had this immense crisis hit the region, and those who we thought had kind of gained or benefited from this economic development that the region saw in the last maybe 1-2 decades were the first ones hit by it, and the ones that are recovering at the slowest. So I think this is where kind of rights and justice issues of economic justice, gender justice, climate justice, racial justice all come together. And I think this is a moment where the region can really think about how all of these combine into a recovery that can help us kind of build the societies that we're hoping to see.
Yeah, I'm struck, just in the conversation with him so many times, he and I both referring to the elites in Latin America, because that is a really standard way of thinking of many of these societies, right? That there is a clear elite, which is very different, and it's obviously relatively small compared to the population of the country. But that is a real structural, organizing principle of much of Latin America. And that seems to be exactly what you're trying to work against, to try to change that dynamic.
Exactly. I think we have states in the region that have served the interests of not everyone. And so that's why I think when you mention about kind of the social unrest, that is a reflection of the issues that we see, that these governments are not serving the interests of the population. And that's where I think from Open Society Foundations, we're trying to look at issues that can kind of focus on the needs of those who have been marginalized and hardest hit by the pandemic. We're thinking about issues about racial justice and economic justice. We're working on the care economy and how to kind of distribute the weight of caring in a global pandemic, and who benefits from care and who provides the care. In terms of climate justice, we see that the most affected by the climate change and the climate crisis are those who were the least responsible for causing it. And so how do we think about development in the region so that those Afro-Brazilians in the Amazon region, indigenous populations, can really be a part of the recovery and benefit from thinking about just and green recoveries that serve their way of lives and their interests without kind of going back and falling back into extractive economies that only create wealth for a few and not for the majority of the people in Latin America.
Yeah, it is. It's a great point that this is a crisis and it gets a lot of attention as a crisis, but there's less conversation about the opportunity it creates to reimagine the development vision. And I think we got a flavor of that today from you, from Luis Alberto Moreno, and we're going to be picking that up as we get into our subsequent conversations in this series. So thank you again, Sabrina Stein. Thank you, OSF, for the support. Really great to be with you. And I want to welcome Tanya Karas back on the stage. I'm not seeing my colleague yet, but here she comes. Okay,
Sorry.
Tanya. No, that's all right.
Raj.
So I wanted you to help us close out the session today. I'd love to hear some of your reflections and what you picked up.
Yeah, I just think that was such an interesting conversation. I think there were a couple of things that really stood out to me, which was, Luis Alberto talked about inequality and good governance. And those are two things that they're so fundamental to a working society, but they're so hard to achieve. And I think that, something he said that will really stick with me is when he talked about the short term, medium term, and long term, and how we're in this era of just unprecedented short-term crises, but we can't lose sight of that long term, because as soon as we do that, you're gonna lose trust. You're gonna lose all these other the ability to achieve all these other important things that we really, really need. So that's
it feels to me a lot like a puzzle, and I think that's what's led to Sabrina's point that a lot of the news coverage around these issues in the region are just uniformly negative. It's not because they're not based on the data or the reality, they are, but this is a puzzle, right, that has to be untangled. And certainly in the development sector, failure is not an option. It's not an option to just say, well, this is a region in crisis and that's it. What do we do about it? It has to be a core of our answer to that question.
Yeah, it really, really does, Raj. And I think, as the global development community, this is a community that is obviously uniquely positioned to look at the long term and to be able to put together the puzzle pieces to go along with your metaphor. So, I think.
Well, yeah, I agree. And I think I'm looking forward in the upcoming conversations to dig a little bit more deeply on two key elements that we started to get into with Luis Alberto Moreno. One, with Roberta Jacobson, really the migration question. She has a lot of expertise in that specific topic, thinking about the crisis in Central America, on the border. The stories are unbelievable. We just got into them a little bit today, but of the thousands of people who are leaving everything behind and traveling sometimes through multiple countries, all the way from South America. So what is really behind all that? What can be done? We're going to get more into that in our conversation with her. And then I'm really excited to talk with Santiago Levy, because he's really the architect of some of these cash transfer and unconditional and conditional programs around nutrition and education that have swept much of the region, and that many people think now you need a lot more support for, and that these need to be scaled up. So we're going to get into some of the social safety net questions in more depth with him. So I'm looking forward to those discussions. And it's been great to be with you, Tanya, and to be with everybody who's been joining us. And thanks for all the comments and questions. I'm on Raj_Devex on Twitter. Look for me. Tell me what else you'd like to hear in these discussions, and we can continue the conversation there. Over to you, Tanya.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you at our next Newsmaker events. And obviously, check out our website. Make sure to subscribe to our newsletters. We've got a lot of great content for you. Take care, everyone.